You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Do you remember where you were a year ago? New York had just become the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States. Italy had just recorded its highest death toll from COVID-19. In mainland China, in Hubei province, restrictions were about to be lowered after nearly 2 months of lockdown following the original coronavirus outbreak. Here at the South China Morning Post, we were making podcasts about the complexities of vaccine production, about travel bans for people traveling from China to Europe, Australia, and the USA, and about how Hong Kong's memory of the SARS outbreak in 2003 was driving social responsibility, like wearing masks and washing their hands. Here we are now. It's March 2021. How are you coping with Zoom calls in your life? Are you still struggling to balance school, work, family, and your sanity? Have you finished with baking your own sourdough bread? Are you getting anxious about seeing people again? And the idea of putting on proper clothes instead of those sweatpants? But really, it seems everyone is asking one kind of question. Have you had your vaccine? Are you booked in? Have your parents been booked in? Which type of vaccine are you going to get? Instead of posting pictures of newly baked bread, their very first handmade mask, or their new work-from-home setup, people are now posting vaccine selfies to social media. Today in Hong Kong, the hashtag HongKongGetsVaxxed is trending on Twitter, with people proudly posting images of themselves receiving injections. And there are now 7 vaccines authorized for use worldwide, and there are 23 new vaccines in the final stages of testing, and another 78 vaccines in clinical trials on humans. In this world war for survival against a virus that has so far killed more than 2.5 million people and left millions more with permanent damage to their health, the tide is turning, but it's far from over. People are tired of wearing masks, tired of staying home, and meanwhile the virus is mutating. New versions of the coronavirus are creating new super spreader events in the Philippines, in the United Kingdom, in Brazil, and here in Hong Kong. Welcome to Inside China. My name is Mimi Lau. Today, we are going to hear from a regular guest on this podcast, epidemiologist Dr. Ben Cowling from the University of Hong Kong. Over the past 12 months, he has made several predictions about what would happen next in the spread of the virus, and they have all turned out to be true. You're also going to hear from him talking about the new variations of the virus, what he thinks about Hong Kong's chances of achieving a herd immunity, and when we might be seeing a return of international travel. And you will also hear from Simone McCarthy, my colleague on the China desk, who has been closely following China's development of vaccines and Beijing's increasing use of vaccine diplomacy around the world. There has been some big news in the last week from China about travels and vaccines, and some fairly major announcements from the Western world in response. Over the past 12 months, most of our podcasts have been produced from a tiny spare bedroom. Jared Watts, our producer, what is it like for you to be finally out of that cave and back in the office?
It's really nice to see humans again, Mimi. It's nice to see you again. It's nice to be back in this office. But I am going to miss the barefoot commute from my kitchen to the cave with my cup of coffee. But no, it's great to be back. Okay, so tell us, have you had your vaccine yet? Not yet, but like you, I have noticed in the last 48 hours just this sudden surge in social media in Hong Kong here, of people posting pictures proudly, kind of showing their arm while they're being injected and stuff. So I am actually booked in to get next weekend, and I think my mum and dad in Australia, they become eligible this week to go and get vaccinations.
Excellent. So what was the most fascinating thing you found after speaking to Dr. Ben Cowling?
You know, we've been going to see Dr. Ben Cowling for almost a year, on and off every couple of months.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting just to see where he is now, where we're in this sort of stage where there's many vaccines, but there's still, here in Hong Kong especially, a high level of vaccine anxiety. And to talk about that and to talk about, you know, this idea of herd immunity, we've all discussed it in the past few months, but what does that actually look like? At what point does Dr. Ben Cowling think we've achieved herd immunity? Dr. Ben Cowling, you got vaccinated 2 days ago, is that right? What was your experience?
Yeah, that's right. I registered for the BioNTech vaccine. I did it at Apley Chow. That's the centre that Hong Kong U is looking after for the government. I went down there in the morning, on Monday morning. Very smooth process, not many people there because it was a soft launch. And went in, got my jab, went to the waiting area, and I filled out the survey for the Hong Kong U pharmacy team who were looking at side effects. And then the day after, the Tuesday, I had a bit of soreness in my arm where they did the injection. Nothing else. I didn't have a fever. I didn't have any other symptoms. And today is Wednesday. So that was 2 days ago. I got the jab. I'm feeling pretty fine. I know where the injection occurred. If I press it, I can still feel a little bit of soreness. But otherwise, it's pretty back to normal. So I'm kind of relieved. I was a little bit worried if I was going to have a stronger reaction. Also maybe disappointed because I know that the strength of a reaction could be an indicator of how good your immune system is or how good an immune reaction you've had to the vaccine. And so I didn't have a fever. Does that mean I didn't have such a good reaction as some other people? I don't know. But what I do know is the BioNTech vaccine is highly effective, 95% effective, even against milder infections after having 2 doses. So I'm going to go back and get my second dose in a few weeks' time.
Now, this is no great secret I'm revealing because you revealed this on your Twitter account. Not many doctors say they're afraid of needles.
Yeah, I've been afraid of injections and needles since I was young. My mother told me that when I was 5 years old, I went to the doctor's surgery for a travel vaccination, came out of the doctor's surgery, was standing with my reward, a pack of chocolates, and then just collapsed and fainted on the ground. I don't know why that happened. And ever since then, I've never really liked needles, and I've fainted pretty much every time I've had an injection, had a vaccination since I was young, including on Monday, actually, I'm sorry to say. But it wasn't a reaction to the vaccine. It was just my personal psyche. And the doctor said I should look into getting hypnotized so I can, have another vaccination in the future without fainting. I'll look into that.
I ask you this because it's a topic of conversation in Hong Kong at a very high level. Vaccine hesitancy, and there's a lot of factors going into that. Yours is more of a needle hesitancy, but here we are in March in 2021. I think last we spoke to you in 2020, some 1,000 years ago now, it was a hope for a vaccine, how things might change, and here we are. There's discussion of vaccine hesitancy in Hong Kong. So can I get to it and say, what's your advice on raising vaccination rates in Hong Kong? What's going on?
Yeah, we've been doing surveys in the community in Hong Kong for months now. Every week we'll do a telephone survey and see how people are thinking about the pandemic. We've been asking about vaccine hesitancy, and we've had some results in the past few weeks. We asked one question. It says that the question goes, when you think about getting vaccinated, do you think about definitely doing it or waiting to see or not getting it? And what we've had, the responses is maybe 25% of people saying they're going to get vaccinated as soon as they can. Maybe 10% saying they really don't want to get vaccinated for whatever reason. And everyone else is in the middle, kind of hesitant, saying they wait and see what happens. They haven't booked their appointment, but they think about it. And I'm not sure what exactly people are waiting for. But when I look at the vaccination centres, the registration status for BioNTech and for Sinovac, there's a lot of green dots showing still availability. And that's despite the government widening the pool so that millions of people would be eligible to sign up, but haven't yet been signing up. Having said that, we're having more and more people vaccinated every day, which is great. But when I look forward to the next 6 months, we've ordered a lot of vaccines, and I hope that we're going to use them in Hong Kong, because having a high level of vaccination coverage is our pathway back to normal. So for myself, I really don't like needles. I'd be okay if I was a person that didn't need to get vaccinated and just rely on others for the herd immunity. But in reality, I know that a lot of people are going to need to be vaccinated. And so I'll do my part for the community and put up with the discomfort. And because I think it's really the right thing to do. And I'm not really looking forward to getting my second dose because I'm scared of needles, but I will do it in a few weeks' time. I will go and have it because I think it's important that I set an example by doing that. And I hope that everyone else will make the same decision to go and get vaccinated.
So Hong Kong has just lowered the age threshold for vaccinations because it was targeting the elderly first and, frontline workers, etc. What does that suggest to you, having to lower that entry age so soon after bringing in vaccinations?
It does seem like that move's been made pretty soon. So the plan's always been to start from the most vulnerable people, prioritize them and healthcare workers and other frontline workers, and then gradually expand to maybe the older middle-aged adults and then the middle-aged adult and then the younger adults. And so eventually everyone can have a chance to get vaccinated, but starting from the highest risk first. So by expanding the program, I guess the government's hoping that we'll have a lot of demand. And maybe actually having a lot of demand would also create more demand if people think that there's going to be a queue to get vaccinated, especially when the fifth wave seems to be starting. Maybe there'll be then more enthusiasm for people to get vaccinated because if you've had 2 doses of vaccine, then you're much less likely to get infected and much, much less likely to have severe disease, even if you were still to get infected. So when the risk gets higher with the fifth wave on the way, then maybe there'll be more enthusiasm for people to get vaccinated and more people can be because the criteria has been widened.
Well, I'll take you back to a conversation we had in July 2020 on this podcast. And you said at the time, at the moment, there's about 40 cases a day. We'll just be mopping these up, maybe with some new outbreaks. Hopefully there'll be no new outbreaks. We are only just a couple of kilometres from the latest super spreader event in Hong Kong at a gymnasium, which is sort of had echoed around the world because the expats, i.e. the white people who work here in Hong Kong, in particular levels like bankers and finance and lawyers, they trained at this gym and that's gone through that community, so to speak. Is there any particular concern you have with that?
Yeah, I'm not too surprised. So what we've seen consistently in Hong Kong over the past year is when we don't have much social distancing, we don't have a lot of government measures, people are meeting their friends, going out to bars, restaurants, gyms, and mixing in larger numbers, there's the risk of transmission and a risk of case numbers taking off and rising higher and higher and higher from week to week. We saw that back in March, we saw it in July, we saw it in October, November, and I think we're going to see it again in March. And each time when that's happened, the government has brought in policies, again, social distancing policies, and people have changed their behavior. I think it's really important that we don't only count on the government to recommend people to work from home or to close bars or gyms. People have to make their own decisions about what they're going to do. And we've seen people deciding to stay at home more often, deciding not to meet their groups of friends. It's tough, but people do it. And the behavioral change and the government measures in March and June, July and November, and again, hopefully now in March, April, those measures have been critical and those behavior changes have been critical to getting case numbers back under control. If those measures weren't in place, we'd see more and more cases every day, and eventually there'd be too many cases for the healthcare system to cope, for the contact tracing to cope, and then we'd have a problem. We've seen what COVID can do in other parts of the world that haven't got numbers under control. In New York, I remember in April when there were a lot of very sick people all at the same time, and we don't want that to happen in Hong Kong. Even now, a year later, we've done so well in the past year. We've kept infections to a very, very low number, and other places look at us with envy. So we can't drop the ball now. We got to stick it out. But our way back to a new normal is with high vaccination coverage. Until we get to that level, it won't be safe to relax all the social distancing measures. We'll probably be in the same mode where we can relax for a while, but then the numbers will creep back up again and we've got to bring the measures back in. They bring the numbers down and then we relax for a bit and then the numbers come up again and we'll have these waves, ups and downs and ups and downs. And that could go on for a year or longer. But we can bring all that to an end once we have a high vaccine coverage.
I asked you what your biggest fear was back then in July. What was keeping you awake at night? And you said it was fatigue, pandemic fatigue. People just tired of wearing masks, of distancing, of not going to restaurants and stuff. Here we are in March 2021. What's keeping you awake at night now?
So if I could just talk about fatigue, we did actually see fatigue in December. So my team's been studying the reproductive number in Hong Kong, how many infections are generated by each case. And if we go back in time to when case numbers are rising in March, in June, or in October, the reproductive number went up to 2 or 3 or even 4 at one point. And that's really a problem. We've got to bring that number back down below 1. And the lower that we can get it, the sooner the wave will be over. So in March, we got it down below 0.5. In July and August, we got it down to about 0.5. That's pretty good. That means infections are going to come down fairly soon, in a matter of weeks, maybe a month or 2, to get down to 0. In December, we barely got it below 1 with all the same measures that had been used before. And I think the difference was we could only get it to about 0.9. The difference was that maybe people's responses were fatigued. They were tired of doing the social distancing, maybe not as compliant with the recommendations to stay at home. And I'm worried that in our 5th wave now, if there's a similar level of fatigue, it's going to be tough to get case numbers under control. And so we may see again, like with the 4th wave, a longer 5th wave. And I really hope that won't be the case, but that's something that I'm still worried about now. But if you ask me now, what's my biggest fear for the coming 6 months, is that we've ordered a lot of vaccine, enough for everybody actually, but we won't use it. That people will choose not to get vaccinated for whatever reason. And so we'll have these measures in place for a longer period of time when we could have got out of it. I'd like to travel again. I know a lot of people would like to travel again. So if we could drop the 14 or 21 day quarantine, that would be great. But we can't drop it until we've got a high level of immunity in the population. It's not safe to do so. And if we were to drop it, we'd need even more social distancing within Hong Kong. And at the same time, we can't drop the other things that we're tired of, the closure, the periodic closure of bars and cinemas, karaoke's, the restaurant measures where we can't have large groups together. All those measures are in place for a reason. Once we get a high vaccine coverage, we can drop them all. We can go back to normal. But that's going to require 70, 80% of adults to get vaccinated. And so far, we haven't seen as much demand as I was hoping for.
You said a few things about herd immunity, which I'll sort of move on to now. Can I just ask a question with this concern about vaccinations, where there's a group of people with a high degree of vaccine hesitancy? Is there a danger of Hong Kong becoming one city, two herds? One herd is immune and one herd is continually, going through these waves and outbreaks?
I don't know if that's likely to happen, because I think if we can't get a high enough vaccine coverage, it won't be safe to relax those measures. So we could still aim for getting 0 cases and staying at 0, and that might be more feasible once we have some people being vaccinated or more people being vaccinated. But I don't know if we'd have a situation where some groups are immune and others are not, and there's an epidemic in those groups, because I don't think the healthcare system would be able to cope. In New York, when incidents reached about 5%, 10% of the population, the hospitals were already totally swamped. And so we just can't afford for that kind of thing to happen in Hong Kong. Even with hundreds of cases a day in December, the hospitals were under pressure. And if we'd gone to multiple hundreds, 1,000 cases a day, I think it would have been very, very difficult. And that's the point at which you see people who need the oxygen, need admission to intensive care, really struggling to get that kind of care. And that's been a problem even in the UK recently, that they just don't have enough resources to care for everybody, and they have to make difficult decisions. And we can avoid that by keeping the numbers to a low level. So talking about herd immunity, I mentioned earlier the reproductive number. Maybe if we weren't doing anything, it would be something like 3 in Hong Kong. So one person infects on average 3. We need to bring that below 1 if we've got increasing numbers of cases, so that the epidemic comes to an end. And the way we've got it from 3 down to below 1 is with social distancing, face masks, contact tracing and quarantine and things like that. If we put vaccination into play, it can replace all those other measures. If we can get more than 2/3 of people immune, then when you've got a reproductive number of 3, one person exposing maybe 3 others on average, if 2 out of those 3 are already immune because they've been vaccinated, then there's only one person left that can be infected. And you can imagine how chains of transmission would then naturally come to an end with that high level of immunity. So at least 2/3 of people immune. And we can achieve a level of 2/3 immunity with maybe 75% coverage of a highly effective vaccine like the BioNTech vaccine. It'd be more difficult if we used a lot of Sinovac because that's not so effective in protecting against infection. But if we have a mix, as long as we get a high vaccine coverage, we should be okay. And I know there's an argument that I've heard that as long as we protect the most vulnerable, even if we don't get herd immunity, we can go back to normal and let the younger adults just get naturally infected. I've heard that argument, but I'm not sure it would work because actually some of the most vulnerable people to COVID are people where the vaccine doesn't really work well or they can't even be vaccinated. And we've heard discussion recently about some types of people that shouldn't be vaccinated if they've got high blood pressure or whatever. Those are the people that are going to be highest risk if they do get infected. So I don't really like the mentality that it's every man for himself and the vulnerable people, that's bad luck if they can't get vaccinated or choose not to. I don't think that's the way we should think about things. I think we should be looking for herd immunity through vaccination in the community as a whole, and then it will be safe to go back to normal. That's not to say that there won't be COVID. There may still be outbreaks. There may still be seasonal epidemics. It may still cause problems on the healthcare system from time to time. We may even need to bring back at some point some social distancing measures, maybe next winter or the winter after, but those will be temporary just to achieve a purpose to get us through the winter. In the long term, vaccination is the way out of the current situation, but we're going to need a high vaccine coverage because COVID is so transmissible.
Herd immunity. What does herd immunity look like for an epidemiologist? Do you wake up one day and there's an email alert? What to you is the evidence that suggests that Hong Kong has achieved herd immunity?
What I'm going to be looking at is the level of vaccine coverage, because that's going to give us an impression of how many people in the population are immune. And then also I'm going to be looking at the dynamics of maybe not the fifth wave, but maybe the sixth wave, if there is one. What I would expect if the fifth wave comes now, as I think it has been starting, so March, April, maybe even May, still fifth wave, then we have a period of calm, hopefully. And then in the summer, maybe if we're unlucky, might have a sixth wave starting. If that wave takes off much more slowly, that's going to give us an idea of how much immunity we've already got in the population. Because even something like 25% immunity is going to make a dent in the numbers. It's going to slow things down. It won't stop it, but it'll slow it down. And if we can go from 25% to 50% immunity, that's going to slow it down even more. And it might be okay if we can get a little bit below that 2/3 level, because we'll be able to slow down any epidemic that does occur. Or maybe that would be an incentive or a trigger for people to decide that they will get vaccinated eventually. And I think by the later part of this year, we will really have enough vaccines in supply in the freezers in Hong Kong that anybody who wants to get vaccinated can be vaccinated. And by then we may be vaccinating children as well. We'll not only have the BioNTech vaccine and the Sinovac vaccine, but also by then the AstraZeneca vaccine and maybe a fourth vaccine as well. So there'll be plenty to choose from, and everybody will be able to get vaccinated if they want to. So I don't think herd immunity is a single threshold. We're not going to have an alert that, an all clear alarm and say that it's okay to go back to normal. We're going to be looking at the level, because the higher immunity we can get, the safer it's going to be to open up fully and to relax all those public health measures that we're frustrated with.
Dr. Cowling, how concerned are you about these two variants, nominally known as the South African and the UK variation?
They are a concern. We don't know everything about them so far, but we've heard reports that maybe people who've been infected with the older virus can get reinfected again with these new variants because they're a little bit different. They can escape that immunity. It's not yet clear whether vaccines are going to provide protection. We've seen laboratory studies in test tubes about how well the old vaccine, the vaccines against the old strain would work against these new variants. And the answer is generally not as good. The vaccine against the regular virus works very well against the regular virus, not quite as well against the variants. That's to be expected. But we haven't seen clinical evidence of how well they work. My suspicion is that people who've been vaccinated may still be able to get a mild infection with a variant because it can escape that maybe initial immunity. But if that infection occurred, it wouldn't be too serious. So in the same way that vaccines protect against severe disease with the regular type of the virus, I think they're also going to provide some degree of protection against severe disease with the variants. So in that sense, we'll will be somewhat protected, but it's gonna impact on our assessment of herd immunity, because it may be possible that we can reach a high level of population immunity against the regular virus, but we could still have an epidemic of a variant in the future. And that's why we've been hearing about booster jabs maybe in a year's time, that one of these vaccine companies could update their vaccine against the South African variant or whatever, and then we could all get that jab, which again, I'm not looking forward to because I don't like needles, but I would have to do it along with everybody else. And so with flu, there's a recommendation for annual flu vaccine because the virus is changing from year to year. And for COVID, it may be the case that we'll need booster jabs from time to time, maybe not every year, but maybe next year and then maybe a few years after that if there's some other variants coming out. I would imagine that after a few vaccines or maybe a natural infection or two, that our body will actually be able to cope pretty well with any subsequent exposures. And my expectation is that COVID in the long term will be more like a common cold infection once we're all more used to it. And to put it another way, I mean, I think if common colds were given to us for the first time in our lives as adults or older adults, they'd be much more serious than they are because we've all had them as children. And so if you think about isolated communities in the jungle, when they first get common colds, which to us are just a sniffle, they can be fatal for some people, particularly if they're vulnerable and they're older. And so I think COVID may actually turn into another common cold infection, maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, once we've all had some level of basic immunity because of vaccinations or infections or both. But we've got to get there first.
You've given us a lot of time. Thank you so much. And good to see you holding up after a year officially of a pandemic.
Yeah, nice to talk to you again.
As critical news stories emerging from China continue to shape lives and business around the world, the weekly SCMP Global Impact newsletter brings you expert analyses and insights on the economics of COVID-19, society, technology, and the environment. Sign up to receive your weekly email at scmp.com/newsletters.
The last time we heard from Simone McCarthy on this podcast was back in January, when she reported on the beginnings of the WHO investigation into the virus outbreak in Wuhan. Simone, can you start with the latest on the vaccines being manufactured in mainland China? We spoke to you and Josephine Ma back in January about the 5 different vaccines being developed, right? What is this about? Another vaccine being granted a license for use?
Yeah, that's right. There's been some new developments on China's domestic vaccination landscape. So I think since the last time we talked, there's actually been 2 more vaccines which were granted market authorization, one of them by a company that already has one vaccine that was approved, China's first approved vaccine, and that's by Sinopharm, but sort of a different version of a similar inactivated vaccine. And then another one is a vaccine by a company called CanSino, which was developed in collaboration with the People's Liberation Army, their scientists. And so this one is actually kind of a game changer for China because it's a single dose shot. So that company has said that their capacity could be something in the ballpark of 500 million doses a year, I think by the end of 2021. And so that could really boost production in China, availability of supplies in China. And then on top of that, yes, as you said, Mimi, there's one more vaccine which just came online last week, and that's just given an emergency use licensing right now. It's actually a 3-dose shot. That one is developed in cooperation with Chinese Academy of Sciences and actually has the head of the China CDC as one of the developers, Gao Fu. Although controversially, they haven't yet released efficacy data. So from the final stage clinical trials. So we're still waiting for that as that's entered into that emergency use licensing bracket. That will also enable that vaccine to begin scaling up production too. And so we're starting to see a lot of different vaccines in China coming online and building up their capacity.
After months of bad news from the United States, we are now reading headlines of the massive rollout of vaccinations across the country. And we are seeing that in places like the United Kingdom and Israel as well. What is the situation in mainland China?
So a lot of experts have said that China's vaccinations have been quite slow so far. Obviously, we have the situation where there's 1.4 billion people in China, and so it's going to take a lot of vaccine to get a significant portion of the population vaccinated. As of right now, the mid-March statistic was around 65 million people. But I think there's some signs that is about to really change, because China has now said that they're trying to vaccinate 40% of the population by midsummer, by July. And so that's some 560 million people. And then the Gao Fu, the CDC director, has also said that he aims for having 80% of the population vaccinated by mid-2022. And so especially that closer midsummer target, I mean, that's going to take a significant ramping up of, getting people excited about the vaccine, getting people into vaccination centers. Because right now, I think there's been some surveys out that have shown that because there is an active spread of the virus in the mainland right now, that people don't feel this incredible urgency to get vaccinated.
Back in December, we talked about COVID-safe travel and how nations will soon be talking about vaccine passports. What is China doing on this front?
Well, there was some big and somewhat controversial news this week, because a number of Chinese embassies around the world at the start of the week started putting up notices that were saying that for foreign workers, the procedures that they need to undertake in order to get a work visa were going to go back to pre-pandemic levels. But that's only if they've taken a Chinese vaccine.
Wait, when you say Chinese vaccine, you mean a Chinese manufactured vaccine, not like the Pfizer shot, which is being distributed in China by a Shanghai company called Fosun.
Yes, that's right. So they have to have taken a vaccine that was manufactured in China. But not all of the countries where embassies release these notices have approved and rolled out Chinese-made vaccines. And so there were some critics who were saying this is another bid at China's diplomacy, and they're looking to kind of use this as a piece of leverage to get their vaccine more recognition. Whereas I think from the China side, the foreign ministry spokesperson, Zhao Lijian, spoke to this recently, and he was saying more that, well, this isn't really about vaccine recognition. It's just that we know that these vaccines are safe and effective, and so we want to rely on them. I mean, I'm obviously paraphrasing there. And he also suggested that vaccine makers who want to have their vaccines included in such a scheme could submit to relevant Chinese authorities.
Wow, sounds like we are moving from vaccine diplomacy into a world of vaccine passport politics. You've been writing stories about this. What have you found?
Yeah, so I think a lot of countries are grappling with how to use vaccines to facilitate travel between borders, or even, to do things within their country. And in the European Union, normally there's free travel, but during the pandemic, there's been some border restrictions. And now the EU has put forward a proposal for a digital green certificate in which people who have been vaccinated or also have negative testing or prior infection can all put proof of those things onto a certificate and move in between countries. So any country that recognizes vaccines for waiving travel restrictions within the European Union has to allow any vaccine that's been approved by Europe's central regulator. But they also have a clause which says that countries can choose to recognize any other vaccines. That's their prerogative. And we already see one European country, Hungary, has rolled out a vaccine by China's Sinopharm. And so I would say it kind of leaves the door open for Chinese vaccines or Russian vaccines, which also are not approved by Europe's central regulator, to also be included in the scheme if countries choose that.
Simone, let me take you back to August last year. You were on this podcast telling us about China's vaccine diplomacy and its plan for Latin America, the Philippines, the Caribbean, and Africa. What is the latest?
It's been really interesting to watch this develop. We had all the way back in May of last year, Xi Jinping saying that China's vaccines should be a global public good. But we had no idea what that was actually going to look like. Now we have seen China make good on its promise with a lot of shipments of donated doses to countries around the world. Some of these countries, some of the first doses that they've received have been in the form of donations from Beijing. These are often smaller scale donations, maybe 100,000 to 600,000 doses, but they're going to a lot of developing countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, South Asia. And so it really has been, there has been a period of a few months when vaccines started rolling out in Western countries at the start of December. And the WHO's global vaccination program had yet to kick off, the COVAX program, which is meant to equitably distribute doses around the world. And China was one of the players who did step in and start sending out doses. Now, we've talked about some of the limitations here. Obviously, there hasn't been extensive peer-reviewed information about China's vaccines that have been published in international journals from their phase 3 clinical trials in the way that the major Western vaccine makers have done. So there's all kinds of limitations, but the doses have been getting on the ground. I think the latest we have is China has supplied its own vaccines to more than 50 countries and exported doses to 27 nations. That's from a foreign ministry data itself.
So what about the COVAX program that is supposed to be helping poorer countries to get access to vaccines? You've been following that as well since May last year. What is China's role in this?
Well, what we've seen so far is largely China making bilateral overtures to countries, many of them countries that China has already some kind of strategic relationship with. And countries obviously have been very desperate to get access to vaccines for their people, to reopen economies and stem the toll of sickness and death. Now, how that factors in with what's going on with the World Health Organization is sort of another story, because right now the WHO has begun rolling out doses around the world. It's got tens of millions of doses have already gone out to over 50 countries. So as far as COVAX goes, they have also now ground into gear. So China is no longer one of, a few countries on the block that are involved in supplying doses. This massive global effort has begun rolling out tens of millions of doses to dozens of countries. And so what is China's relationship to COVAX? Well, China has agreed to join COVAX, meaning that it's one of, 90 countries, over 180 countries that are part of the facility. But China has yet, as of the latest update, has yet to give any financial support to COVAX as far as helping to buy doses or fund doses for the poorer countries, which is sort of the financial mechanism for how COVAX works. China has said that they'll give 10 million doses to COVAX. However, COVAX is only accepting vaccines that have been approved by the WHO, understandably. And so 2 of China's more advanced vaccines, meaning more advanced in the timeline, one from Sinovac and another from Sinopharm, are expected to get a decision perhaps even as early as this month about whether or not they're approved by the WHO. As of right now, until they get that approval, those companies and Beijing itself cannot supply COVAX.
So that's China's approach to vaccine diplomacy. Well, are you seeing any pushback from Western nations on this front? Was it much of a surprise when this meeting of the so-called Quad, the leaders of the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, announced a brand new vaccine policy for the region?
Yeah, these countries really made a huge announcement as far as vaccine supply last Friday when they had their summit between the leaders of those 4 countries. And essentially what they said was, we are going to get 1 billion doses made by the end of next year, and we're going to distribute them in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And so right now there is a huge focus on the need to bring more manufacturers online to get COVID vaccines out of, off of production lines, out of the factory and into people's arms. And a lot of experts don't think that's going to stop. It's not going to be like everyone's vaccinated and we're done. It may be more of a kind of fluid situation where we have new variants coming or the vaccine efficacy wanes over time. And so we need booster shots. So it's critically important, and this is coming from the head of the WHO down to many experts are saying, we got to really flex our manufacturing muscles globally. And so what the Quad is doing is essentially part of that. They're basically partnering with a big biopharmaceutical company in India. And the idea is that the US is funding those doses, and some of them will be by Johnson & Johnson, the American firm who just had its vaccine has just been approved by the WHO. And then the other countries are all sort of playing different roles in that. Australia and Japan will also be playing a role in helping helping support the infrastructure in countries across the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia to get those vaccines out once they're delivered into the country. So they have said that they'll work in conjunction with COVAX. So it's a really big the United States has not been praised for the way that it's been a global player in vaccine access so far. The U.S. has said they're not sharing doses until everybody in the U.S. is vaccinated, although they did just decide to give some doses that aren't yet approved in the U.S. to Mexico and Canada. But generally, that's been their stance. And so this really changes the game. And it also has sort of some of that lens that you put on it in your question, Mimi, which is that, well, they may also be doing this in part to counter China's so-called vaccine diplomacy in the region. And so a number of experts that I spoke to when I was following up on that story after the announcement were pointing out that this is also a counterweight to what China is doing in giving doses to a number of countries in the region so far.
So, Simone, in June last year, you introduced us to a public health specialist named Dr. Deborah Gleeson, who told us about the concerns over Big Pharma controlling the IP, the copyright, so to speak, of vaccines and making them too expensive for developing nations. And this is some of what she had to say back then.
If a US company is the first to come up with a vaccine that's effective in fighting COVID-19, I think that will be very problematic because the US hasn't given any undertakings to make the intellectual property available to other countries or to share the data and knowledge that goes into developing that vaccine.
That was before any vaccine had been developed. Here we are. There are almost 100 new vaccines in late-stage development and testing, on top of the ones already authorized. Where are we in this debate over making vaccines IP-free and to allow developing nations to make cheap copies of them?
Just to set the stage a little bit here, basically this comes down to a huge debate in the World Trade Organization. And there was a proposal put forward in October by South Africa and India, and they basically want to be able to waive certain intellectual property rights temporarily during the pandemic in order to allow manufacturers around the world to just manufacture these vaccines without having to go through contracts with the vaccine makers themselves. So there's about over 100 countries that have come forward in support of this, largely developing nations. And then there's a handful of wealthier countries, including US, UK, that are staunchly opposed. And as of the latest discussions, which were last week, everybody's still in a stalemate. And China seems to have not taken a very firm stance one way or the other. According to a Geneva trade official, they essentially support the conversations around this and think that it's a good point of discussion, the proposal that's been brought up by India and South Africa. But a number of countries who are also in opposition have made similar statements about how this is something that should be continued to be discussed. And so that's the status of that right now, is that they're going to keep discussing it. But the other route, which I think these discussions put pressure on to happen more, is this licensing and tech transfer, which is like the example that I gave with the United States funding this producer in India to make 1 billion vaccines. It's that kind of thing. We have a Johnson & Johnson vaccine. We're going to give the technology, know-how, kind of the recipe for the vaccine to this manufacturer, and they're going to make it. And so that's via an agreement with the vaccine maker and the manufacturer. And so that's kind of the other route that a lot of groups are focusing on right now. COVAX also has several agreements like that, and China has been doing that too. So Chinese companies have arrangements with manufacturers in several countries, including Indonesia, Brazil, United Arab Emirates. And so that's already something that China has been doing. And I think it's a way for Chinese vaccines to be part of the global rollout, also without taking away from doses in China that may now need to be feeding into that boosted domestic vaccination drive that I mentioned earlier.
This is fascinating, Simone. But there's one more question I have to ask. And originally, when we planned to speak to you about a week ago, it was the first question on the list. What's happened to the WHO report on Wuhan? You've been following this story very closely.
Good question. Question on many minds right now. It's been delayed a few times. And the latest that I understand is that it's possible it could be released next week. But China's foreign ministry today said that there's an English version, but not yet a Chinese translation. I'm not sure if that will hold up things next week or not, but we're certainly waiting to see.
Well, thank you, Simone, and we look forward to catching up with you when this Wuhan report comes out.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Well, that's all we have for you this week for Inside China. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with all the latest developments in vaccines and the moves to restart international travel at scmp.com.
And we're always deeply grateful when people give us good ratings, especially on iTunes, share us on social media, and we love the comments that people post on YouTube. Thank you very much. Mimi, where can people find you on Twitter?
Thank you for the plug. My Twitter handle is GZMIMI. Wherever you are, I hope you are able to get on the list for vaccination.
Keep your distance, but stay in touch.
Bye-bye.
Hooroo.
For more podcasts from the South China Morning Post, head to SCMP.com, where you can hear more about technology, trade, culture, and society.